Today we're going to talk about how certain elements will cycle throughout the environment. Although there are many nutrient cycles, we're going to focus on 4 of them today. We're going to focus on the water cycle, how water travels through an ecosystem. We're going to focus on the carbon cycle, as well as the nitrogen cycle and the oxygen cycle. So water is actually a molecule, and carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen are 3 different elements. And all of these, the molecule water, as well as the elements carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, are necessary for living organisms. So let's take a look at the water cycle to start with. Here is a picture showing all of the different events that are happening in the water cycle. Now, because this is a cycle, you can start at any point. However, let's just start right now with the ocean, where we see large amounts of water. Water in the ocean ends up evaporating and turning into water in the air. As the water molecules get higher up, they cool even more and they start to condense, which means the evaporated water, the gas water, starts to come together and go from a gas to a liquid again. At that point, when the water molecules become a liquid, it's going to precipitate. Precipitation is just raining, so it's going to rain. And the water from the air is now traveling back down and landing on the soil. Now from here, something occurs called runoff. This is when the water starts to pool together. And if you notice after a really large rainstorm, a lot of times you'll see little streams of water connecting into other streams of water. These different streams of water start to pool together and they run off back into the lakes, oceans, and other bodies of water. But not all of the water makes it back into the ocean. Some of the water that is now in the soil is actually taken up through the roots of plants. The plants absorb this water in their roots. But how exactly does the water travel up through the plant? Well, this is a process called transpiration. So transpiration is how water travels up through a plant. And what really happens is that the water droplets on the leaves of the plants evaporate. And when the water droplets evaporate, they tug on the droplets below, because all of these water droplets are bonded together in something called a hydrogen bond. So as the first water droplets on top of the leaves evaporate up into the air, they tug on the droplets below, and those tug on the ones below that, and those tug on the ones below that, until the whole column of water moves up through the stem of the plant. And it ends up moving through the plant and evaporating into the air, where the cycle continues. The water in the air condenses through the process of condensation, which means the gas turns back into a liquid. The liquid water is now heavier, so it's going to precipitate and fall or rain on the earth. That water is now in the ground. We can call this groundwater. And the groundwater is going to do a process called runoff. The groundwater will collect with more water, forming little mini streams that'll merge with larger streams that will then go into a lake or an ocean or other bodies of water. From there, the water will turn from liquid water into gas vapor, water vapor. This is called evaporation. The water vapor is now up in the air. As it goes higher, it starts to cool and it starts to condense, going from the vapor, the gas, back into the liquid, where it will precipitate onto the soil, and the groundwater can either run off into the lakes, rivers, and streams, or it can be taken up through the plants in a process called transpiration, where the water evaporates from the top of the leaves and that tugs all the water below. And the cycle happens over and over again. The next cycle is the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is a little more complicated. We can see a picture of it right here. So let's start with the carbon in the atmosphere, in the air. This is in the form called carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide in the air is taken up by plants through the process of photosynthesis. The plants turn the carbon into C6H12O6. This is sugar, glucose, in a process of photosynthesis. So the carbon dioxide in the air is turned into sugar in plants during photosynthesis. We end up getting our carbon by eating the plants. Therefore, we're eating the sugar, the carbon in sugar. When we die, plants and animals both have this sugar in our bodies. We're made of carbon. So the carbon that makes up plants and animals will end up returning to the soil. And decomposers will break apart the carbon in dead plants and animals. In addition, bones or fossils from the dead plants and animals will remain in the ground, and the carbon trapped in those fossils will eventually turn into oil and coal. These are what we call fossil fuels. Now, it used to be that this oil and coal and these fossil fuels would just remain in the ground. However, now we're actually able to take the coal and the oil and the gas and the fossil fuels out of the ground, and we burn them to get energy. When we burn them, we release emissions. This puts that carbon that should have remained in the ground back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. In addition, plants and animals both do a process called cellular respiration. So, for example, the sugar that's in our bodies, we break it up to get energy from it. And when we break up that sugar, we release carbon dioxide. That's why we're constantly breathing out carbon dioxide. Now, these are the major contributors to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When we burn that fossil fuel, and when we're breathing out carbon dioxide during cellular respiration. In addition, some carbon can be released through volcanic eruptions, and when fires occur as well. The next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, like carbon, is in the air. Okay, it's a special form of nitrogen in the air. The nitrogen in the air, when it's in contact with the soil, is turned into a type of nitrogen that can remain in the soil. It's turned into this by kind of special bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The process that takes the nitrogen from the air and turns it into nitrogen in the soil is called nitrogen fixation. That nitrogen in the soil can then be taken up through the roots of plants, and that's how plants get their nitrogen. Now, there are some plants that are special. These are the kinds of plants like legumes. which are things like beans and pea plants. They actually have an adaptation. They have a special kind of way of getting their nitrogen from the soil. Their roots actually will have nitrogen-fixing bacteria in them. So the nitrogen in the air, when it's mixed in the soil, can be turned immediately into a kind of nitrogen that the plants can take up. So while this tree here, which does not have the special roots that have the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in them, this tree needs to be planted in soil that already has nitrogen-fixing bacteria there that are doing the process of nitrogen fixation. Because the tree hopes that bacteria has already turned some nitrogen into the kind that it can take up. The legumes can be planted anywhere because they carry their own nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots. So it doesn't matter where we put this legume, it's always going to have the bacteria do the process of nitrogen fixation so it can get nitrogen. But how do we get nitrogen? As animals. Animals eat the plants, and this is how we take in our nitrogen. So the process in which plants and animals get nitrogen is called assimilation. So once again, the nitrogen from the air during nitrogen fixation is turned into a kind of nitrogen in the soil. It's then taken up through the roots of plants, and animals eat the plants in order to get their nitrogen. Now, plants and animals will all die, and the nitrogen that's in our bodies will be returned to the soil when decomposers pull apart the nitrogen in the dead plants and animals. But once again, this is a cycle, so it needs to return back to the beginning. So the nitrogen in the soil, there's actually another kind of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria that will take the nitrogen compounds in the soil and turn them into a kind of nitrogen that can remain in the air. This process is called denitrification because we're undoing the nitrogen fixation that originally occurred. So bacteria are really driving the nitrogen cycle. They're taking it from the air, putting it into the soil. They take it from the soil, put it back into the air, and they also turn it into forms that plants can take it up. And once again, as plants and animals die, it's bacteria and fungi, which are another kind of decomposer, that take the nitrogen from dead plants and animals and return it back into the soil. The last cycle that we're going to talk about is the oxygen cycle. Now, in order to talk about the oxygen cycle, we're going to mention carbon again in the form of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is in the air, and as we said, the process of photosynthesis takes the carbon dioxide from the air and turns it into sugar in a plant. But photosynthesis also releases oxygen into the atmosphere. That oxygen is necessary for cellular respiration. So when plants perform photosynthesis, they put oxygen into the air. Right now, as an animal, we're all breathing in that oxygen for the process of cellular respiration. We take in that oxygen for cell respiration and we release carbon dioxide. And this cycle continues in the atmosphere. In addition, plants also perform cell respiration. Let's take a look at what's going on in a plant cell because it's actually doing both processes, photosynthesis, which releases massive amounts of oxygen, and it's also doing some cell respiration. Here's a quick sketch, just an outline of a plant cell. So light enters the chloroplast of the plant cell.